Hi, good evening, everyone. And thank you for joining us for another virtual New Orleans Book Festival discussion. My name is Robin Foreman, and I'm the provost here at Tulane University. And that means I'm the chief academic officer and have the remarkable privilege of overseeing the research and educational missions of this wonderful institution. And I really am very excited to welcome our special guest today. You know, if 5 years ago, when I was living in Atlanta, long before the idea of moving to Tulane and New Orleans had ever surfaced, you had asked me to name my two favorite nonfiction authors, I would have immediately named Michael Lewis and Walter Isaacson. And I have to admit, after I moved here, I was amazed, just stunned to learn that they were, not only were they both native New Orleanians, but they both attended the same high school. I really had no idea. So it's really very exciting for me to be here and to introduce them. These authors really, need no introduction in a literal sense, but protocol requires they receive one. And I'm honored to do so. Michael Lewis has published several New York Times best-selling books. His most recent works are The Fifth Risk, The Undoing Project, and Flash Boys. Three of his books have been adopted into extraordinary films including Moneyball, The Art of Winning an Unfair Game, The Blind Side, Evolution of a Game, and The Big Short, Inside the Doomsday Machine. Michael has an extraordinary gift for finding compelling human stories that create a powerful emotional core for explorations of fundamentally important, but sometimes quite complicated technical subjects. Michael is also a columnist for Bloomberg View and a contributing writer to Audible. His articles have appeared in Vanity Fair, the New York Times Magazine, The New Yorker, Gourmet, Slate, Sports Illustrated, and others. He's filmed and narrated short pieces for ABC's Nightline, created and presented a 4-part documentary on the social consequences of the internet for the British Broadcasting Corporation, and recorded stories for the American public radio show This American Life. And if I can add a personal note, my son and I are big baseball fans, and we read Moneyball together when he was really quite young. And then when the movie came out, we saw it several times together. My son was fascinated by it. He went on to major in data science in college, and now he does Moneyball for a living. He is a research analyst for a Major League Baseball team. And if I can put in a plug, the team is the Washington Nationals. And so he actually participated in a ticker-tape parade after the season last year. Walter Isaacson is without a doubt one of the preeminent biographers of our time. And he's the Leonard A. Lauder Professor of American History and Values at Tulane School of Liberal Arts. He's the past CEO of the Aspen Institute, where he's now a distinguished fellow, former chairman of CNN, former editor of Time Magazine. He's currently host of the show Amanpour and Company on PBS and CNN, as well as a contributor to CNBC. Walter has authored such best-selling books as The Innovators, how a group of hackers, geniuses, and geeks created the digital revolution, Steve Jobs, and Einstein, His Life and Universe. His most recent biography, Leonardo Da Vinci, draws new insights from the life of the great Renaissance man, and as in some of his previous books, explores the connections between his art and his science, between the humanities and technology. Walter presents his subjects consistently with great compassion and as real human beings, complicated in the way that any real person is, which serves simultaneously to humanize them and also to give the reader an even greater appreciation for the enormity of their accomplishments. Walter's books about these great inventors, scientists, explorers have changed entrepreneurial cultures and communities around the globe. While chronicling the lives of these great creative geniuses from the past, Walter's provided a blueprint, followed by current innovators, scientists, and even university administrators, hoping to follow in the footsteps of these great masters and create an environment in which innovation can flourish. Many businesses in Silicon Valley in particular have been redesigned and reimagined based on the insights from Walter's books. You know, like the best writers throughout history, Michael and Walter are not just reporting on the world, they are reshaping it. And this is our chance to learn about what they're working on now, what they're thinking about, and what they'll be reshaping in the future. So please welcome Michael Lewis and Walter Isaacson. Michael, Walter, take it away.
Wow, that was far too kind. Michael, unmute yourself so we can chat. Hey, where are you, Michael? You're looking good.
I'm in exactly the same place that I was when they took that picture that's on the front of your program. I'm sitting in my office, which is a little redwood cabin down a path from my house in Berkeley, California.
And you'll be moving back to New Orleans someday, though, right?
You know, you and I have this conversation over and over and over, and we're never going to stop having this conversation. But you seem determined to bring me back there.
We all come home.
You know, there's some truth to that, and and it's also true that until we got out here to this place and raised kids in Berkeley, that I never thought of New Orleans, any other place but New Orleans, as my home. Now I think of myself as kind of having two homes, but it is, as you know, like impossible to get New Orleans out of your system. I mean, it just kind of goes with you wherever you go. And I was a little surprised when I saw that, you know, you had moved back there, but it's starting to make more and more sense. Yeah. And every time I see you, you look just a tiny bit happier. And yeah, I mean, it's so anyway, it's good to see you. It's been too long.
Well, you know, I want to thank you and tell people that my next book involves somebody in Berkeley, a great genetic engineer named Jennifer Doudna, and I sleep in that guest cottage where Michael's sitting, I think, right?
No, I'm just across the driveway from where you.
Oh, you forgot. Michael has a very large compound, unlike those of us who live in the French Quarter.
Yeah, I don't. You live more modestly than I do. Don't you, Walter?
But yeah, I will tell you a little secret that your kid comes into the guest cottage when I'm there to play Fortnite, the game, because you banished him from playing it in the house.
Yes. You know, I'll just apologize now for whatever happened when you were here. But you're always welcome. And it is true. I am 2 miles away from your subject of your current book. But anyway, yeah, I'm here. I've basically been here since the pandemic started. I've not gotten on an airplane. I've done some driving, but we're basically been hunkered down here. Well, I assume you have there.
Yeah, we've been out and about. The restaurants are open now. So anyway, let's get to this. You do mention that you had your picture taken there for the front of the book fest. One reason is because even though we both went to Newman, you stayed looking incredibly young, and I was trying to figure that out. And so I looked at your books. You know, here's the new thing, right? I looked at this really, really good author's picture you have. So, well, that's cool. He looks so young. And then I'm looking at your next book, and you haven't changed.
That's a year apart.
You know, Robin talks about Moneyball, and I'm like, okay, I pulled it out to read today. There it is. You know, my publisher makes me change the author's picture every now and then, so I don't look like a 22-year-old.
Yeah, well, but if you pulled up the most recent book, you'd see a more recent picture. I have the rule of thumb. Yeah, that was taken a year and 2 years ago. It's like every 4 years I change it. The truth is that I can't stand having my picture taken. The worst memories of my childhood was the family Christmas picture. So they drag me out, tie me up, and take my picture every 3 or 4 years.
All right. So let's get into the book writing business. And let me start by asking you some questions. One of which is, you've always found these amazing characters somewhat tangential to the action, whether it be Maury Taylor when you were doing a campaign book so many years ago, or Jim Clark, a great Tulane person you use as a central character. And then with the Undoing Project, you introduce us all to Kahneman and Tversky. How do you find your characters?
They find me in a funny way. You know, it's true that in general, I've avoided taking on really obvious subjects. I mean, I would say The Big Short's kind of exception, right? The Big Short was as obvious a subject as it gets. It was Wall Street in the middle of a global financial calamity. But partly because of what I'm doing, and partly because if I read it in the newspaper, I tend to lose interest. I tend to be attracted to people who aren't obviously at the center of something, but who I think are at the center of something. And what the process requires me to be so immersed in their lives that, I don't know, if I were going to try to write a book about Obama, I couldn't actually do it the way I do it, because I could never get the access I needed. I sort of need people I can really get to know, who the reader gets to know. And what tends to happen with me is I get interested in an area, like, I mean, a really good example would be Moneyball. I was really interested, just like what was going on with money in sports. I was interested in I was interested in the financial disparities, both within teams and between teams, that you had, you know, a left fielder being paid $8 million and a right fielder being paid $200,000. How furious was the right fielder when the left fielder dropped a fly ball? And then there were, you know, rich teams and poor teams. And I started kind of kick around the area, and then find that there's this guy running a very poor team and running circles around everybody else. And then Billy Beane is not at that point a household name. I start to get to know him and realize this guy's actually a literary character, that he's got the dimensions of a literary character, and he's in a situation that's incredibly interesting and rife with ideas and scenes. And so that's how it tends to happen. What doesn't tend to happen is, in fact, I don't think it's ever happened, where I meet somebody and I think, oh, I want to write a book about them because they're so interesting. And then I got to figure out what it is they do and why their situation. It always starts without the person, and then the person walks onto the stage. And in fact, it's kind of like it's almost the opposite of what you do, right? Generally, you have been attracted to these great characters, and then you figure out everything else, right? Am I right?
Yeah, I mean, I sort of like larger than life creative types, especially those that can mix the humanities with engineering and technology and figure out how their minds work. But you're right. For me, it's easier to do some larger than life character, but yours, you get to turn things into a parable. It's almost biblical. You find somebody and you're teaching a lesson. Do you know the lesson you're going to be trying to teach when you start the book?
No. I do. By the time I sit down to write a book, I generally know, I think I know where it's going to end, and usually do. Sometimes I've even written the last line of the book. I think that's where I'm going. So I need to kind of know where I'm going. But I don't. When I'm just getting into it and trying to figure out what the book is, it's a process of learning what the lessons are and what I'm trying to get across. I have some general sense of it, but I don't go in with a lot of preconceived notions. And very often it takes me a little while to figure out, you know, like who the characters are, who's important, what's important. And
well, let me go to one of them in specific that's particularly interesting at this moment, which is The Blind Side. And that's a little bit different because we were joking about Sean Toohey, a friend from Newman, who is one of the main characters, who is, you know, brings in Michael Oher into his house. How did you end up taking a Newman friend and turning it into a story? And did you mean it to become a story about race?
So it's a funny story because it's a very Newman and New Orleans centric story, because what had happened was Moneyball was published in 2003. And all of a sudden I had license to write about sports. And the first thing I wanted to write about was this character who loomed in my imagination, Billy Fitzgerald, who'd been my coach at the Newman School, my baseball coach. And I happened to be going through Memphis. I thought I really should talk to some former teammates before I write about Billy Fitzgerald. I remembered that Sean Toohey, who I had not seen since high school, lived in Memphis. I called him up and he said, I'll pick you up at the airport. You know, yeah, I'll talk to you about, happy to talk about Coach Fitz. So where it gets funny is I get in the car and the first thing Sean Toohey says to me is, who writes your books? And I said, I write my books. He goes, no. He goes, I see on TV selling them and you're like, you're great. You're like, your marketing of your books is incredible. Who actually puts the words on the page? And I said, I put the words on the page. He goes, no, you don't. You were a dumbass in the back of Dr. France's English class, just like me. You got C's. There's no way you wrote these books. It took me the whole way from the airport to his house to persuade him I wrote my books. But we get to his house, and Michael Oher, who is the child they have adopted literally off the streets of Memphis, is in the living room. And he's 15 or just about to turn 16 years old, and he's 6'5" and 350 pounds. And Sean doesn't say a word about him. And I'm not even introduced to him. We sit and talk about Billy Fitzgerald at nauseum, and then Sean drives me to my hotel. And as he's driving me out, I said, who's the kid? And he starts to tell me the story that is the beginning of The Blind Side. And it took me forever, you will appreciate this, I'm sure, but forever to accept the possibility that someone I grew up with was going to be a major character in something I wrote. It seemed like it should be against the rules. I just thought, and what happened was I was doing two things at once for the next year. I was trying to figure out if there was an equivalent to write in professional football for what I'd done in professional baseball. It was different because it was, if you go to the professional football teams, they say we all have the same amount of money. It's not, there are rich teams and poor teams. But we think about how we distribute the money around the team differently. Like some people think some positions are more important than other positions, and in their schemes they are. But it turned out that I started to look into this, and there was this odd thing that had happened in the market for professional football players once it became a market, once they were free agents. And the odd thing was that this person who nobody knew they really paid much attention to, the left tackle who guarded the quarterback's blind side, had gone from being the least paid person on the field to the second highest paid person on the field. And I'm learning about that. And I'm learning about the Sean Toohey, Leanne Toohey raising of Michael Orr story because I'm talking to Sean all the time. He's just telling me unbelievable anecdote after unbelievable anecdote. And then one day he calls up and he says, "You're not gonna believe what happened." I said, "What?" He says, "Nick Saban, who was then the coach of the LSU Tigers, came through to look at some kids at our school, and he saw Michael playing basketball in the gym and said, 'Sean, that's an NFL left tackle.'" And I thought, well, I cannot turn my back on this story. My wife, Tabitha, actually said, "You've got to write this story." I mean, every time she'd hear the anecdote, she'd start to weep. And the story was about and this is where you may start with like a Benjamin Franklin or Steve Jobs. When I get to a book, it's usually because I've got to like some central, like reducible to 2 sentences idea. And the idea is, I'm going to write a book about all the forces that affect the value of this child. And some of those forces are strategic NFL football forces, which make him all of a sudden this exalted prize. And one of those forces is a mother. And it's what's going on inside of that family. So I had an idea for what that book, then I have a book. Then I think, there's a book, there's a book. And something like that happened with all my books. And I know you're asking me questions right now, but I am curious because the contrast is so interesting. Yeah. How do you start? I mean, what is that? Like, what is the equivalent for you? How do you say, I'm going to write a book about Steve Jobs or Leonardo Da Vinci? Or I mean, what's triggering the first impulse?
Well, I'd like to think that there's some great first impulse that sets me, but it's sort of one thing leads to another. I had written with one of my college mates a book called The Wise Men, which is about the early foreign policy. And it ends with Vietnam. And I said, okay, I want to do Vietnam next. So I did it through Kissinger. After dealing with Henry Kissinger and writing a biography of him, I said, man, I'm going to do somebody who's been dead for 200 years. So it's like, who's been dead for, and it's like, well, the thing about Kissinger was he was very interested in balance of power, realist diplomacy. And so I said, well, who is comparable to that? Because most Americans have an idealistic view of foreign policy. They don't have a good sense of realpolitik. And the only person, having done that after, Kissinger did that realpolitik was Ben Franklin, who played a balance of power game when he got the French played off against the British and the whole Bourbon-packed nations to come in on our side in the revolution. And when I finished doing Franklin, it was like, hey, he was a really good scientist. And the science really affected his diplomacy, his whole view of the world, balances of power, checks and balances in the Constitution, all come from Newton. I really ought to try to do a scientist. And so I went on to do Einstein because I wanted to demystify science. Ben Franklin or Thomas Jefferson would feel anybody who's not a Philistine should understand the science of their day. But Einstein made it too complicated. So we all got, who were not scientists, got a bit turned off by science. I wanted to demystify that. And then, I was out in, having done Ben Franklin and then Einstein, I get a call from Steve Jobs. And he says, do me next. I'm thinking, okay, yeah,
So
I'm
that's
laughing like
but that's a turn in your life, right? Because that's when the first time someone says "do me next," or
right.
someone who you are going to take them up on it, right?
Right. And at first I deflected. I said, man, you're my age. Let's wait 30 or 40 years until you retire and maybe I'll do it then. And then somebody said, if you're going to do Steve, you got to do him now. And that's why, and I realized he had been diagnosed with cancer. I said, well, I didn't know that. He said, no, he's been keeping it secret, but he called you the day after he was diagnosed. And once again, that was a really interesting topic, but it was very much a personal thing about a guy who goes into his dad's garage and creates the most valuable company on the planet. And I realized that that's not really how history works. It's more about collaboration and teamwork. So I decided to do The Innovators, which is about all the collaborators, people like Wozniak and others. And then finally, Steve told me, when he was talking about the theme of the book that I was doing on him, he said, it's really about connecting the humanities to the sciences. You ought to do Leonardo Da Vinci someday because he's the one who did that best. And I've just became more and more fascinated with Leonardo's science. So that's how that one worked.
There's a pressure on an author to have a story about how a book came about once the book comes out. And I find myself, it's hard to resist it. You start to craft a better narrative about how your book came about than actually happened in real time. And I have these very smoothly worn pebbles of stories about how each book came about. It doesn't really reflect the messiness of the process. It's an incredibly messy, for me, chaotic process. And I do feel, one of the things you just said that's interesting to me is that, you're kind of stringing circus elephants together.
Yeah.
And I do feel in a previous life that I was a manager of circus elephants. And that part of what I'm doing is I'm trying to find the story that I have permission to write. If I don't really feel I have permission to write it, if I can't tell myself a good story about why I should write this story, even though it seems like a great story, it's not mine. And so finding that story about the story ends up being hugely important to me.
I once, I've had some stutter steps where you try to figure out one thing leading to another. And I once tried to do Louis Armstrong. And I spent 2 years up in Corona, Queens.
I remember.
I obviously down here in New Orleans, I used to play clarinet and, knew some of the people who played with him, like George Lewis. And after 2 years, I knew everything you could possibly know about Louis Armstrong, except for who he is. I couldn't tell why he was smiling. I didn't know if he was happy. I didn't know if he liked white folks. I didn't know the most basic thing, and I gave it up. I have a whole stack of stuff. You can look behind me. There's all the Louis Armstrong material in that case. Have you ever had that stutter step where you had to put something aside?
Yes, and in fact, and it's one of my characters, Amos Tversky, in the Undoing Project.
Yeah.
One of his first things he told all of his students, he was referring to scientific research, but and also to life. But he said, you've got to ignore a sunk cost. It's so hard when you've invested in something a great deal to just walk away from it. And I find I've gotten better and better at doing it rather than worse and worse. But the most painful one was when I stumbled into the Moneyball story. I remember coming back to this very desk where I'm sitting from a night with the Oakland A's, and I'd had a revelation what the whole book was about. And it was 2 books. It was the book I wrote, and it was a second book, which was going to be about a group of kids who were college kids, mainly, who they had just drafted, and none of whom had thought they were really that valuable as baseball players as the Oakland A's thought they were, because the A's had found ways to analyze their performance that nobody else was using. And so they had cases where they would call up the catcher from the University of Alabama baseball team and say, we're about to make you a first-round draft choice. And the kid said, this is a crank call. He didn't believe it. He thought his teammates were pranking him. And I thought these kids really interest me, these people who don't know their own value and are about to be told it. And I want to follow them through their journey. And I spent 2.5, better part, actually, I didn't give it up for 4 years, but I was actually like in uniform with the Midland Rockhounds AA baseball team in the dugout in this one summer, because I was gathering the material for that. And I have piles and piles and piles of stuff about these guys, and it never amounted to anything, because I realized at some point that what I was trying to do got eaten by Moneyball. With it, part of what I wanted to do was trace the future of this like data-driven approach to sports in the context of these kids' progress. And what happened was Moneyball came and it exploded, and the stuff was all over the place, and the story was, 18 other people had the story. So it ceased to be, but that's the biggest investment I made. I made another investment. This actually relates to you, and you won't remember this conversation. But after my first book, Liar's Poker, came out, you and I had a drink in a bar in New York, and you said to me, I'm waving my pen at you. You said to me, Michael, that was great. You wrote that book. It's delightful. It's funny. But now you have to write your book about a great man, a great person. You need like a big central character. And I thought that wasn't it never occurred to me that I would do such a thing, but it stuck in my head. And I thought, well, it would be an interesting exercise to go and do a Walter Isaacson book. And I got in fairly deep with George Soros, and actually had a book contract. And then he got cold feet. So I walked away. I had to walk away from that. I could have done it in a way where I didn't have all of his cooperation, but I just didn't want to do that. So I've had a couple of moments like that.
We intersected recently because of something that has a New Orleans connection, which is the Salvator Mundi painting by Leonardo Da Vinci,
yes,
or by his studio.
Yes.
And I had written about it in my Leonardo book.
Your wonderful Leonardo book. Yes.
Sold, the one that sold for $420 some odd million.
Mm-hmm.
And it had been hanging off St. Charles Avenue, right, for many years. And then you had me come talk about it on a podcast where you were trying to figure out how experts work, how referees or judges or experts do their thing. And I was pretty much convinced that this really was an autographed good Leonardo. And you kind of pushed me away from that. But tell me, I want to hear both about how you decided to do a podcast, how you decided to do referees, and about that Leonardo da Vinci painting.
Well, the Leonardo da Vinci painting, everything I knew about it, I knew from your book. And your book was a trail of breadcrumbs to suspicion. Whatever you say you thought about it, when you read your book, anybody who read your book would have said, if they'd offered you that painting for $400 million, you wouldn't have bought it. No. There was an awful lot of, it didn't smell right. But the podcast, in which you were actually spectacular, by the way. But the podcast came about.
By the way, I get more feedback from that podcast than I do from the book. I think more people heard me on your podcast than have ever read my book. So I don't know what to make of that.
So Malcolm Gladwell and Jacob Weisberg, Malcolm, well-known author, Jacob serves as both our editors. But Jacob, they started a podcast company called Pushkin Industries. And they asked me to be their first guinea pig. And Jacob, they basically lied to me. They basically said it doesn't take much work and you're going to make a lot of money. And it takes an incredible amount of work and it doesn't pay. But it is actually creatively, unbelievably exciting and gratifying. And I thought, what's this podcast going to be about? I think I want it to be about authority figures in American life and what's happened to their status, various authority figures. And the first season, I picked referees. And I picked referees there were a zillion reasons, but the first seed of an idea I had to do something about referees was watching my daughters when they were really little, playing sports and watching, umpires get punched out in parking lots kind of thing. I couldn't believe the way people treated referees. And if you start thinking about the referees in American life, regulators, not just out in sports, but in various walks of American life, if they are actually trying to serve as neutral, objective authority, they are under attack. And the point, I think the point of the show we did, one of the points of the show that we did was that when you find referees who are really happy, it's usually because they're usually bought by one side or the other, and they're making a great deal of money. And I think of credit rating agencies, Moody's and Standard & Poor's being a good example. Paid by the people who issue the securities. They make a good living. Is their advice objective? Let us go, but rewind the tape and look what they did in the run-up to the financial crisis. And art experts are sometimes this way, in that they are, one way or another, they get very invested in an attribution. And it just seemed to me, reading your book, that this was a case where that had happened. But I had no independent ability, except for the fact we must agree that just on the face of it, what is the likelihood that a New Orleans couple drags home for $50 or whatever they paid for it, a picture from an auction in England and hang it on St. Charles Avenue until it's discovered and all of a sudden it's worth $425 million and it's a Leonardo? That seemed just preposterous. So you were on the podcast and we talked about this. What is your feeling about the Salvator Mundi now? How do you, it's been, the Saudis bought it and they hid it and we don't get to see it anymore. But what do you think's going on there?
Well, first of all, I think that, Leonardo had a studio and he had a whole lot of students. So they churned out a lot of Madonnas and a lot of paintings. Very few were purely done by him, but he would design it. And I think the Salvator Mundi comes from a design of Leonardo's. He probably walked around and put a few brush strokes, but it's been so over-restored, it's ridiculous. So MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, and the Saudis buy it, which is somewhat
odd on the face, right? Yes.
You explain why? Yeah.
Well, it is a Christian image,
right?
So,
and they even don't like religious images, even obviously
right.
of the Prophet Muhammad, much
right.
less. So it's odd that he buys it, and just buys it really sight unseen for this huge amount. I was there for the auction just to hang out and see it. Then he gives it to the Louvre that's being built in Abu Dhabi. And so clearly it's art diplomacy. It's cheaper than having battleships or something. You have something that you can allow the Emiratis, the UAE, to make their museum the greatest thing in the world. And it's from the Saudis, and it helps bring you together in that complex Persian Gulf War where everybody hates the Qataris and whatever's happening. So then here's a theory I have that we should not spread too widely because I have no proof of it. It never goes on display in Abu Dhabi. Right. And it's supposed to be in the Great Louvre show in Paris that just closed for the 500th of Leonardo, and there's a space for it there, but they never show it there. And my theory, having talked to the curators at the Louvre, is that because their name is on this museum in Abu Dhabi, it's called the Louvre Abu Dhabi, they have curatorial rights, they have editorial rights, and they were not going to label the painting Salvator Mundi by Leonardo da Vinci. They were going to say from the studio of Leonardo da Vinci or attributed to Leonardo.
Right.
Well, that takes a $425 million painting and makes it worth about $4.2 million. You lose 90% of the value.
Yeah.
And so the Saudis, the Crown Prince, decides, well, that's ridiculous, doesn't let it go on display in the Louvre Abu Dhabi, doesn't put it in the Louvre show, and is now keeping it in hiding, basically, and then they're going to do something with it in Saudi Arabia.
Do you think if he could do it all over again, he'd buy the painting?
Oh, I mean, it'd be nuts to buy the painting. I mean, he didn't get anything of it. I mean, it's actually a haunting, mesmerizing painting. I mean, I saw it a few times. Saw it when it was in London once, and then saw it at either Christie's, Sotheby's. I can't remember what the auction house was. But I would think anybody should buy it for $4 million. It's just, you wouldn't buy it for $400 million. It's ridiculous.
Anyway, yes, this occasioned an appearance by you on the podcast, and to close the podcast conversation, I would say it's interesting the relationship this medium has to what we do with in our day jobs. You say you get a lot of response to it. The audiences are vast, and it's for the simple reason it's the one thing you can consume, cultural thing you can consume, and be doing something else at the same time. You can't read a book and and commute, but you can listen to a book. But you can't. But you can listen to a podcast, and I found the audiences. I mean, we've now done 2 seasons of this, and we basically know that we have 1 million people who've actually listened to each one of these things. I mean, to the end, and that's just. I mean, my book audience isn't as big as your book audience. My books don't sell as many copies as your books, but for me, that's more than any book of mine sells the first year it's out.
I have a theory about podcasts that goes back to our mutual hero, Walker Percy, the novelist from here, was his famous line that people coming out of Louisiana are in 2 categories, preachers and storytellers. And he always said, for heaven's sake, be a storyteller. The world's got too many preachers. Whether you're on This American Life or you're doing your podcast, it is a medium made for storytelling because you can't click and jump around and follow links. You have to sit back and listen. And I think there's a hunger now in this age of too many pundits and too many preachers on TV these days to say, tell me a story. Yeah.
No, I think it is a beautiful storytelling medium. It's totally true. And people respond to it different from print. The response to print can be admiring, but it's usually, my experience of it is it's cooler. That when someone sees me and they've liked my books, they say, I liked your books. Yeah. When someone sees me and they've heard the podcast, they might hug me. They have this, because they feel like they have this emotional connection, because it's kind of coming in here. And there's something about coming in here that can be very powerful. And I found as I've been doing it, that if you're really going to harness the power of that medium, you keep one hand on emotion, that you make sure that what you're doing is in the service of some emotion rather than some argument. And the arguments are nice, but it's the emotional content of the story and the sound of people's voices. And people laugh and they cry when they're listening to them.
Well, when you do it that way, they do.
Well, but in any case, it's been a really interesting exercise. It's like working a different muscle. And I put it to one side now because I finished the 2nd season and it's just finished airing, and I'm gonna go write a book again. But it's been really helpful to do and interesting to do.
By the way, what is the next book?
It's a pandemic book. So I'm in the middle. I'm in the middle of it. I'll go first, then you go on what the next book is. I want to hear about Jennifer Doudna. So the last book I wrote was called The Fifth Risk, and it was essentially about we misunderstand our federal government and the people who work there, and that you've got to view this enterprise as a giant existential risk managing enterprise, among other things. And the people who work there are often unbelievably giving, gifted, underpaid, society savers. And we have lost that thread in our society, and at great risk, because the point there was something is going to happen, and we are now at much greater risk of it being mismanaged. Well, something's happened. Yeah. And so I was saying earlier about I feel I need to have the right to write a story, like why me? And I think that's just led me very naturally to. I mean, when this happened, I've been looking for the storyline.
Yeah, we had one of the questions. In fact, we ought to get to our question soon, but you answered one of them, which is, what would be your next risk after the 5th risk? Well, the pandemic.
Well, so when I was working on the 5th risk, I had on the floor of this office, all these folders with the various things I might have addressed. And I took the folder marked pandemic and I said, too obvious. Center for Disease Control, pandemic. Everybody kind of knows that. They wouldn't screw that up, would they?
I hope you kept the folder. And you have a good central character?
I have, it's very similar to The Big Short. In this, it's an ensemble piece, but they're three very powerful characters. And yes, and I'm just like chomping at the bit, because that's what gets me juiced, is I have characters I just want to get out there, and I have these characters. So tell me what you're working on, because I know kind of, but
Sorry?
I know kind of, but I sense it might have changed a little bit.
It has changed some, and I've been out there. There's a woman named Jennifer Doudna who co-invented what's called CRISPR, which is a technology to edit our genes. So if you want your kids to be taller, you want them to be smarter, blonder, if you want them not to have sickle cell anemia or Huntington's disease, we will be able to edit our genes. And that's a really big scientific, but also a moral issue. And she is in a wonderful competition with the people at MIT, including Feng Zhang, who also helped co-invent this technology. They get into a patent battle. But now they've put all their battles aside, and they are jointly working on using CRISPR to defeat viruses. Because what CRISPR is a system that bacteria developed about 3 billion years ago that remembers every virus that ever attacked that bacteria, encodes a little snippet of it in the bacteria's DNA, and then attaches it to an enzyme that knows how to cut that genetic material if it ever comes back. In other words, it's a way to have an immune system that adapts to each new virus that comes along. Just what we need in this day and age when it feels like we're living in the Middle Ages with wave after wave of epidemics. So the book has now changed after we get through the editing of human DNA. We get this big battle and race between the two. We now have them working furiously I have them working furiously in order to solve the problem of viral epidemics for human beings. And she's a great character. I mean, she's fun. I want your daughter, Dixie, to meet her at some point, because Dixie will be a great biochemist as well.
She wants to be, but you let me ask you this. Because it's interesting how what you're doing, the kind of thing you're doing now is closer to what I've done for much of my career. And you, as I have been, are more at the mercy of current events in your story than you probably suspected you were going to be.
Well, definitely, and also not having these grand, larger-than-life characters, having people, Feng Zhang at MIT and Jennifer Doudna at Berkeley, and her partner, Emmanuel Charpentier from Paris. These are like your characters. They're not famous. And I guess it was because you didn't take my advice and write about somebody famous. I had to come do what you do for a living.
What I was going to ask you is, it is incredible how the world has conspired to deliver you the ending to your book. But the question is, if we had not had a pandemic, did you know where your book was going to end?
No, it was definitely a problem. Everybody I've written about, including Steve Jobs, we know what the ending is. And this was difficult because there was no natural ending. But I think in the spring, when they have DNA vaccines for this virus, I hope that will be, a happy ending to this. I know we have some questions here from the audience, and I can't read my chat room very well, so I'm depending on people who are texting them, retexting them from the chat room.
Yeah, I see one. Can I ask this one? Because it looks like
you go first.
It's for both of us, and you can go first, and then I'll follow you. But who or what would you say influenced your writing the most? Friend, teacher, instructor, life change, so on and so forth. And that's from Jim Esposito.
Yeah. Well, first of all, to go back to tout our high school, which feels silly, we had some pretty good teachers. Mrs. Grout taught me grammar, and Mr. Prescott and all. And I learned sort of the joy of reading stories. And then there was Walker Percy, who I mentioned earlier. I didn't quite know who he was. Tom Cowan, who was his nephew. We used to go to the Covington, go skiing on the Bugafalaya, go fishing or turtle hunting. His daughter was there, Ann Percy. She was deaf and so did sign language. It was all very interesting. but we never knew what her father did. And I'd say, Ann, what does your dad do? He's always sitting on the dock drinking bourbon and eating hogshead cheese. And she said, well, he's a writer. And I said, what is I mean, I knew you could be a fisherman or an engineer like my dad or a lawyer like your dad, but I didn't really know how you could be a writer. And then I read The Moviegoer, and he took me a bit under wing and said, you know, just be a storyteller. And that was the biggest influence for me. What about yourself?
So in a funny way, I'd say there are three obvious answers. One, my father. I did not conceive of myself as any kind of writer or intellectual or anything when I was at the Newman School. I mean, I kind of got through the Newman School, and in a very uninspiring fashion. And as Sean Toohey said when we graduated, the only prize they gave us was the little medal they give you for being there for 13 years.
What's the name of it?
I can't even remember.
Rebecca Scott Kiefer Award.
Oh, very good. So so that's the only award. It's the only award I got. And it was, but I did, when I was going, especially towards my later years there, I would hand my papers over to my father and have them edited. And he had a wonderful ability to be concise and to the point. And so he would show me, and he'd hand me E.B. White, Strunk and White's little book. And the one sentence takeaway is use as few words as possible to say as much as possible. And the power of concision is not to be underestimated. So that would be the first voice in my head about how to put words on a page that really stuck. I'd have to also, I think Billy Fitzgerald, my baseball coach, without him, I don't think I'd be a writer. Because I think he kind of taught me how to work. And he kind of taught me how to work in the joy of taking risks and sort of like reaching for great things. I internalized that with him. So
there's the most amazing scene in things you've written is there's a moment in Coach in which you're been put in, I think for Sean Toohey was pitching, and you have to.
It's all very small world here. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's a guy on third base, and you're not that good as a pitcher, and it looks like y'all might lose the game. And Coach Fitz comes out and says, "Pick him off."
Yeah, he says pick him. What he actually said was pick his ass off and then strike his ass out, and that's exactly what happened. But he said the thing he said that was so great was it was a high pressure game and it was a high pressure situation. As he said, he put the ball in my hand. He said, "There's no one in the world I'd rather have out here right now." And it was such a lie, but he sort of started to create a narrative for me at age 14 that I then lived for the next 3 or 4 years. And it just became second nature. Give me the ball, I'll win. And I do feel when I'm writing a book, give me the ball, I'll win. Mm-hmm. And just give it to me. Give it to me, get
Actually,
out of here.
Your mother is watching this. I don't know if we can pull her up. This is not something we've planned. It's not like some reality show, but if Diana.
I pray that she can't get on here.
Can you pop up Diana Lewis, let her ask a question?
But then, so the other like huge influence in my life was a cluster of other writers whose books I just lost myself in, and Walker Percy was one of them. Yeah. And I don't know about you, but I didn't have a sense. I mean, I didn't grow up, although my parents read a lot of books and all the rest, and they're highly educated. I didn't grow up thinking a writer, like you. Like I didn't know any writers. I didn't know anybody who knew any writers. Right. And so this discovery that there was this guy in Mandeville, whose nephew was in my class at Newman, who wrote books. Yeah. That we could do that here. I mean, yeah. that was actually a really important moment.
I think he would really appreciate the fact that we were so amazed that he could write books that it ended up starting our career. I got one of my own students. I don't know, is Diana there, by the way? I guess not.
She might have texted me. You look at what you're looking at. I'll tell you.
I've got one of my students.
God's watching you.
Uh-oh. Say that again.
There she is. She said, God's watching.
I said, God is watching you.
Be careful.
Yeah. Be careful.
My student, Ben Bernstein, one of the great students I have at Tulane, says younger generation seems to have shorter and shorter attention span. Do you think this threatens their appreciation for books and that take time to consume?
Well, you tell me, because your books take longer to consume than mine. I write shorter books than you do. How do you feel as a writer of very long books? Do you feel people get to the end of your books, or you think they're faking it when they talk to you about it?
It was a great thing that your friend Michael Kinsley did many years ago.
Yes,
People wrote these long books, and people would say, oh, I just finished Strobe Talbot's Deadly Gambits, or I just finished second volume of Kissinger's memoirs. And he went to a bookstore, and he put little slips of paper the way saying, if you are in this book, call me and I'll give you whatever,
$100, yeah.
$100. And he said, nobody ever called. Nobody gets to the end of those long books. In a more serious way, I think that, and Ben was in my class on the digital revolution, the digital revolution has shortened our attention span. It makes us hop around on social media and web, and we link and go back and forth. And the web and the internet is very good at that. You can sort of search around and grab things, and you know, something catches your attention out of the corner of your eye, you go in that direction. What a narrative does, it says, just shut up for a while and listen, because I'm going to tell you a story.
Right.
And Arthur Haley once said, those are the 6 most powerful words, or let me tell you a story. And I think that there is an important place for narrative in this interactive age. And I suspect there'll always be a hunger for it. I think it's a very human thing to say, let me tell you a story, or please tell me a story.
A story makes connections between things.
Mm-hmm.
And the web, as connected as it all is, it really is all about disconnectedness. And so I think that when I read a story, it takes my mind in a very useful way and lets it do stuff that that nothing else does. So I agree with you that there's always a place for, there'll always be a place for narrative, and there's the power of a story is incredible, and you can pull people in all kinds of things they would never go to, all kinds of places they would never go to if you give them a story to follow. Mm-hmm. Having said all that, I do think you're better off writing a 70,000 word book than a 400,000 word book. I think that it's just, and it's sort of like there's the economics of time. You know, as we become a more and more affluent society, people place more and more value on their time, and it's harder and harder to steal that time away. So I think that it's an age that's friendly to the just right length story. But it is probably harder. It's certainly harder to get people to sit down with a long, long book. But that may not be all for the bad.
Got a question from Scott Humphrey, since you're doing the pandemic and I'm doing it as well, which is, what do you think will be the lasting implications, or one of the lasting implications of the pandemic?
I think it's going to be a while before we lose that reflexive feeling that when we see another person, we're seeing a potentially infectious disease, a carrier. This distance stuff is going to linger in the air for a while, like the handshake and the hug and all. It's going to take a little while for people to be less wary around each other. I pray, that's kind of the downside. Mm-hmm. I pray that one of the results of this is that we figure out how to manage these situations better. We have 4-point-something% of the world's population and almost 30% of the world's deaths. We have 130,000 people, whatever, have died. Thailand, which has a fifth of our population, 58 people dead. I mean, we have so embarrassed ourselves. And it's especially embarrassing that it's like we have the smartest scientists, technologists, data people that we have. It's like if you took the 2018 Golden State Warriors and managed to coach them to the last place in the NBA. We have this collection of talent that is horribly organized. And I'm hoping that one of the takeaways from all this is we've got to allow ourselves to organize ourselves better and play like a team, because it's been horrific.
That's what your book, The Fifth Risk, does that, which is, here's how we should do leadership transitions. I have a couple of thoughts about where it's going to lead. One comes out of this Zoom call. I've been spending today working on my Tulane course, which will be taught partly in person and partly online. We've talked for 15, 20 years about how MOOCs and massive online courses were going to change education. Never happened. Now I think we have an upside to it, which is I'm creating really short, good videos, I hope, that help teach my class, but also interactive discussions, exercises. So I'll be able to turn the class into something where they can watch the lectures at night or whenever they want to do it. And I'll do the interactive stuff with them during the classroom period. So I think it's going to help reform education. But it'll also tell us the value of a campus-based education. Because if you do it online and you don't have people around, actually just being on campus, it's quite difficult. So I think Tulane is managing this extraordinarily well. I'll also say that I think one of the silver linings of this hurricane, as people on this call, on this Zoom know that all hurricanes have to have some silver linings, is that people will understand science better. I mean, nobody would joke about not knowing the difference between Leonardo da Vinci and Picasso, but not knowing bacterial chromosome or equation from a differential equation or something. People joke about not understanding science. I think this will bring biology into our lives. We'll start having, just like we have Alexa and cell phones and personal computers, we'll have a home biology kit where you'll be able to test yourself, do your sequencing of your DNA, find out if you have viruses. These things will be coming along from Amazon and from Jennifer Doudna's lab in the next year or so. So I think we're all going to have more of a respect and an appreciation for biology. We went through the past 50 years as an infotech revolution, a digital revolution, based on three great inventions: the microchip, the internet, and the computer. They combined, you got a digital revolution. The next 50 years, and your daughter is going to be a part of this, the next 50 years are going to be about a biotech revolution. When we learn to edit our genome, we learn to have personalized treatments for cancer. We learn how to have an adaptive immune system that bacteria have so that we can fight off each new virus. So I think we'll be moving from the digital revolution to the biotech revolution, and it's been sped up by this coronavirus.
We only got like a minute or so left. Can I ask you a question that I've always wanted to ask you?
Mm-hmm.
And you're not allowed to dodge the question. You got to give me an answer. I'll frame it in a way you have to answer. Which of these great characters, these great figures that you've written about, do you feel is most like you?
Oh, Ben Franklin.
Really?
Yeah, when my daughter, I was chatting to her, she was very young. She said, "Oh, Dad, all biography is autobiography." And, and I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "Well, when you wrote about Ben Franklin, you're writing about a journalist, publisher, magazine person who wanted to get into diplomacy and foreign policy, but was also an upwardly striving, almost yuppie person who loved everything from science, art. You remind me of Ben Franklin." And so I said, "Well, what was I doing when I wrote about Einstein? That wasn't autobiography." And she said, "No, you were writing about your father, my dad. Because my dad is was a kindly engineer, scientist with that halo of hair, very much like Einstein." And so then I finally said to her, "Yeah, and Steve Jobs, a bratty little kid who thinks he knows everything. I guess I'm writing about you." But for me, I found if I could be with anybody right now, it'd be Ben Franklin, because he was just so curious about everything. From botany to the Gulf Stream to how they were doing governance in France. And so I will do the last question that you can't dodge, which is, when are you going to New Orleans
So you know what's so funny is you've just clicked out, and I didn't actually hear the question except the very beginning. When are you going to? And I can guess what you were going to ask. When are you going to write your New Orleans book? And if that was the question, that there will come a time when I feel like I can be like it's the moment for me to come back to New Orleans, and sort of re-engage with the place. And you're right, there's a story. There's a great story there. But I feel like it should be the last story rather than just another story. I mean, I feel like it's in the future. Anyway, this has been a total pleasure.
Hey, Michael, it's great to be with you. I can't wait to read that book when we're all having been together in our salad days.
Yeah.
It's nice to be here for the dessert course, and I'll read that book on New Orleans someday.
All right. Good talking to you, Walter.
And thank you all for joining us and at the New Orleans Book Festival. Please go to the website, and man, you'll find whatever we're doing next. And thank you, Lindsay and Allison and Cheryl, Landrew, and everybody else who put this together. Bye-bye.